With this, let's move on to the chapter discussion. This chapter is divided into four major parts. First, we will be looking at Bengal and the zamindars in the colonial period. Then we will look at the competition between the hoe and the plough and what that meant for India's economy and people. We will be studying about this in this section. In the third section, we will talk about the revolt in the countryside, that is the Bombay Deccan. And finally, we will do a quick discussion on the Deccan Riots Commission, which studied the causes of the revolt in the Bombay Deccan. So let's look at Bengal and the zamindars. So the chapter opens with a discussion on an auction in the district of Bardwan in the Bengal region, where a number of mahals or estates held by the Raja of Bardwan were being sold. So the permanent settlement had come into operation in 1793. Now the East India Company had fixed the revenue according to the permanent settlement so that each zamindar would have to pay this fixed revenue. The estates of those zamindars who would fail to pay were to be auctioned to recover the revenue for the British Company. Now, since the Raja of Bardwan had accumulated huge arrears, his estates had been put up for auction, and many new purchasers came into the auction and the estates were sold to the highest bidder. But the collector of Bardwan, who had organized this auction, soon discovered that many of the purchasers who had bought these lands at the auction turned out to be servants and agents of the Raja who had bought the lands on behalf of their master. Over 95% of the sale at the auction was actually fictitious. Only 5% lands had actually changed hands. So 95% estates of the Raja of Bardwan actually came back into his own hands. But then why had the Raja failed to pay the revenue? If he could buy back most of his property, why at all do that? Who were the purchasers in this auction, and what does the story tell us about what was happening in the rural areas of eastern India at that time? So we had mentioned the permanent settlement in the previous slide. Permanent settlement was a land revenue system. You would have studied this in class 8, and I hope you remember some at least basic parts of what you had studied. But the first question is, why did the East India Company have to introduce it, or what are the advantages? So 1757, the Battle of Plassey had taken place and Bengal had passed into the hands of the British Company by then. And in about 15 years' time, so that is by 1770s, the rural economy in Bengal was in crisis. There were recurrent famines and declining agriculture output. Officials felt that agriculture, trade, and the revenue resources of the state could all be developed by encouraging investment in agriculture. Now, why this concern? Because if agricultural produce is falling, the British revenue collection is falling as well. So, how do you encourage investment in agriculture? The company felt that this could be done by securing rights of property and permanently fixing the rates of revenue demand. So they thought that if the revenue demand was permanently fixed, one, the company could look forward to a regular flow of revenue, and the zamindar, on the other hand, would feel sure of earning a profit on this investment since the state could not siphon it off by increasing its claim. So the idea was that the agricultural prices would continue to rise, and the difference between the agricultural income and the tax that had to be paid would continue to increase, and this could be kept by the zamindar. So the company was very confident that the zamindars would therefore be motivated to invest in the land, right? So that they would improve their land by using fertilizers, mechanization perhaps, and try to increase the agricultural output. And because the third advantage here would be that because the zamindars would also understand that their wealth is completely dependent upon the company, they would remain loyal to the East India Company. But then this was a great story. But why is it that the zamindars were defaulting on payments? Couple of reasons for this. First one, that the initial demand was extremely high. So since the company felt that they would not be increasing the revenue anytime soon, in anticipation of higher agricultural prices, they decided that let us put the initial demand very high. Second problem is that the expectations of the British company didn't really come true because there was a decline in agricultural prices from the 1790s onwards. So the Rayats could not sell their crops for a very high price, which meant that they could not pay their dues to the zamindar, which in turn meant that the zamindar could not collect the revenue on time and submit it to the company. The third problem was the sunset laws. Now, one of the clauses of the permanent settlement said that if the dues were not paid by the sunset of the pre-decided date, no extension or concession was to be given, even if the crops had failed for any reason. And if there was non-payment of the revenue on the set date, the zamindari was liable to be auctioned. Fourth problem was that the company limited the powers of the zamindars. So the permanent settlement limited the coercive powers of the zamindars, their troops were disbanded, customs duties were abolished, and their kacheharis or courts were brought under the supervision of a collector appointed by the company. Now, the zamindar had no way of forcing the jotdars and rayats to pay, who often purposely delayed payments to get the zamindar in trouble. The zamindar could file cases against the defaulters, but the judicial process was very long drawn out. And by the time the zamindari of Burdwan was being auctioned, there were already 30,000 cases which the zamindar had filed on various peasants and the jotdars. Now, who were these jotdars? So, by the early 19th century, the jotdars had acquired vast areas of land, sometimes as much as several thousand acres. They also controlled local trade as well as money lending, and which gave them enormous power over the poor cultivators. A large part of their land was cultivated through sharecroppers, who were called either adhiyars or bargadars. Adhiyars means those who get half a share. These sharecroppers brought their own plows and tools, they labored in the field and handed over half of the produce to the jotdars after harvest. So this also meant that without much effort, the jotdar was able to get a large part of the agricultural produce for himself. The jotdars were most powerful in North Bengal, in fact, and although rich peasants and village headmen were emerging as commanding figures in the countryside of Bengal, the jotdars remained, the foremost among them. So in some places they were called the hauladars, elsewhere they were known as the gantidars or mandals. And as they rose in power, this inevitably weakened the zamindari authority. Let's see how. So let's look at the differences between the zamindar and the jotdar. Zamindar most likely lived in the city, and the jotdar lived right in the village. Because the zamindar lived in the city, he was physically far removed from the rayats. The jotdar was closer to the rayats. This physical distance between the zamindar and the rayat resulted in reduced influence over the rayats, whereas the jotdar was able to increase his influence over the rayat through money lending as well. And often the jotdar would mobilize the rayat against the zamindars and encourage them to default on rent payments. And finally, the zamindar could not counter the influence of the jotdars because of the above three reasons. And on the jotdar side, it was often the jotdars who actually went in and bought up the zamindaris as they were being auctioned. But it was not as if the zamindars had no choice. They also did have their strategies of resisting, and one of these was the fictitious sale, as we saw in the case of the Raja of Burdwan. So what he does is he first transfers some of his zamindari to his mother, since according to company norms, the property of women could not be taken over. Then as a second move, his agents manipulated the auctions. So the revenue demand of the company was deliberately withheld. So it was not as if the Raja of Burdwan was actually unable to pay the revenue. What his agents do is they deliberately withhold, and they allowed these unpaid balances to accumulate. As a third step, when the part of the zamindari was auctioned, it was the zamindar's own men who would attend the auction, and they would outbid the other purchasers. So subsequently, when they refused to pay up the purchase money so that the estate had to be resold again, once again it would be bought by the zamindar's agents, once again the purchase money was not paid, and once again there would be an auction. So this process would repeat endlessly, and the company would lose patience. And ultimately the company never could recover the unpaid balances, and the zamindar never really lost out most of his lands. But that being said, we do know that about 25% of the zamindaris did change hands. There were many zamindars who were ruined, especially those who were unable to work out these strategies to save themselves. There were some other strategies that zamindars used as well. So when, let's say, for example, a zamindari is sold and the zamindar's own agents are unable to outbid and buy the land, what they would do is the agents would attack the agents of the new zamindar, and the new zamindar's agents were unable to take over these new lands. Sometimes even the rayats would resist the entry of outsiders. They did bear some loyalty to their own zamindars, and they refused to serve the new zamindars. So the new zamindars did not find it easy to extend their control over these newly bought lands. So where does the fifth report come into it? Fifth report is an official document. This was submitted to the British Parliament in 1813. Because it was the fifth of a series of reports, it was called the fifth report. And what did this report? This reported administrative activities of the East India Company in India. They were supposed to periodically submit this to the British Parliament. And this particular report ran into 1002 pages, of which over 800 pages were appendices that reproduced petitions of zamindars and rayats, reports of collectors from different districts, statistical tables on revenue returns, and notes on the revenue and judicial administration of Bengal and Madras, which is presently Tamil Nadu. These were written by the officials here, and this was produced by a select committee. So these were not company officials, but these were agents of the parliament, right? And the fifth report, like the other reports, became the basis of intense parliamentary debate on the nature of East India Company's rule in India. Now, why was that? So first, let's look at what was the purpose of these reports. These were a report on the administrative functions and administrative problems that the East India Company was facing in India. It was in 1757 that the company establishes its rule in Bengal in the mid-1760s. Its activities were closely watched and debated in England. There were many groups in Britain who were opposed to the monopoly that the East India Company had over trade with India and China, especially in commodities like tea and silk. So these other, especially the landed gentry and the merchants who were not part of the East India Company, they wanted a revocation of the royal charter which had been granted to the British East India Company in 1600 that gave the company this kind of trading monopoly. There was an increasing number of private traders who wanted a share in the India trade, and industrialists of Britain were also keen to open up the Indian market for their own manufactures. Now, many political groups within Britain argued that the conquest of Bengal was benefiting only the East India Company, but not the British nation as a whole. So they brought in that element as well. Information about the company misrule and maladministration was being hotly debated in Britain, and incidents of the greed and corruption of company officials was being widely publicized in the press. So the British Parliament, because of this kind of pressure, they passed a series of acts in the late 18th century to regulate and control company rule in India. It forced the company to produce regular reports on the administration of India and appointed committees to inquire into the affairs of the company. So this is what was really behind the production of these reports, of which the fifth report is important for our study. The evidence that was contained in the fifth report is invaluable, but official reports like this have to be read very carefully because we know that there was a purpose behind it. Yes, there was an agenda behind it. So we need to know first who wrote these reports and second why they were written. So in fact, recent researches show that the arguments and the evidence offered by the fifth report cannot be accepted uncritically. We need to be very careful when we examine them. So when researchers have carefully examined the archives of various Bengal zamindars and the local records of the districts to write about the history of colonial rule, they indicate that intent on criticizing the maladministration of the company, the fifth report might have actually exaggerated the collapse of the traditional zamindari power and also overestimated the scale on which the zamindars were losing their lands. Actually, one, there could be exaggeration. Second, they may not have understood the strategies of the zamindar to actually have their own agents buy up their zamindari. So as we have seen, even when zamindaris were auctioned, zamindars were not always displaced. This brings us to the second section of the chapter, and where we will be discussing about farmers who use the hoe and farmers who use the plough. But before that, let us move to the hills of Rajmahal, west of Bengal. So in the early 19th century, there was a person called Buchanan who was traveling through the Rajmahal hills, and from his description, the hills appeared impenetrable, a zone where few travelers would venture, an area which was considered to be dangerous. And Buchanan's journey gives us these little glimpses of the hill folk in the early 19th century. His journal was written as a diary of the places he visited, people he saw and encountered, and practices that he saw. So if we look at the late 18th century revenue records, we learn that these hill folk were known as the Pahariyas. They lived around the Rajmahal hills, they subsisted on forest produce and practiced shifting agriculture. So what they would do, they would clear patches of forest by cutting bushes and burning the undergrowth. On these patches, which would be enriched by the potash from the ash after the undergrowth has been burnt, the Pahariyas would grow a variety of pulses and millets for self-consumption. Not much of it was meant for trade. They would scratch the ground lightly with hoes. They cultivated the clear land for a few years, and when the fertility went down, they left it fallow and then moved to a new area. During the right seasons, they would collect from the forest mahua for food, silk cocoons, and resin for sale, and wood for charcoal production. The undergrowth that spread like a mat below the trees and the patches of grass that covered the lands left fallow provided pasture for their cattle. The life of the Pahadiyas as hunters and shifting cultivators, food gatherers, charcoal producers, silkworm rearers was therefore intimately connected with the forest. How did they relate with the outsiders? One, they did not like outsiders, so they resisted the intrusion of outsiders. Their chiefs maintained the unity of the group, settled disputes, led the tribe in battles with other tribes and the plains people. With their base in the hills, the Pahadiyas would regularly raid the plains where the settled farmers lived, and these raids were actually necessary for survival, particularly in years of scarcity. They were also a way of asserting power over settled communities, and they also used it as a means of negotiating political relations with outsiders. So zamindars often had to purchase peace by paying a regular tribute to the hill chiefs. So this was another part of really the Pahadya economy. The traders also would give a similarly small amounts of money to the hill folk for permission to use the passes controlled by them. And once this toll was paid, the Pahadiya chiefs would protect the traders, ensuring that their goods were not plundered by anyone. But this negotiated peace was fragile and it did break down in the last decades of the 18th century when the frontiers of settled agriculture were being extensively and aggressively being extended in eastern India. You have a new element when the British East India Company comes into this region and feels that keeping these lands just as forested was a waste of valuable resource. So, to the British, extension of settled agriculture was necessary to enlarge the sources of land revenue, produce crops for export, and establish the basis of a settled and ordered society according to their understanding. And Pahadiyas and similar communities which moved from place to place were seen as obstacles to such plans. So, as settled agriculture expanded, the area under forests and pastures contracted, and this began to sharpen the conflict between the hill folk and the settled cultivators. The hill folk began to raid settled villages with increasing regularity, and they would carry away food grains and cattle. Exasperated colonial officials felt that these were criminal tribes and they tried to desperately control and subdue the Pahadiyas. How did they intend to do that? So, in the 1770s, the British embarked on a brutal policy of extermination, hunting down the Pahadiyas and killing them. Then they followed a policy of pacification from the 1780s onwards, when Augustus Cleveland, the collector of Bhagalpur, proposed that the chiefs be given an annual allowance and be made responsible for the proper conduct of their men. The chiefs were now expected to maintain order in their localities and discipline their own people. And this is the reason why, and this was perhaps the background to why the Pahadiyas would avoid Francis Buchanan. So when Francis Buchanan was traveling through this place, people were hostile. They were apprehensive of the officials, did not want to talk to them. In many instances, they even ran away and deserted their villages when they heard that Buchanan was coming in. As a result of the company's policy of first trying to exterminate them and then pacifying them, the Pahadiyas lost all trust that they had in these outsiders and withdrew deep into the mountains, insulating themselves from hostile forces and carrying on a war with outsiders. So when Buchanan travels through this region in the winter of 1810-11, the Pahadiyas naturally viewed him with suspicion and distrust. The experience of pacification campaigns, the memories of the brutal repression shaped their perception of the British infiltration into their area, and every white man appeared to represent a power that was destroying their way of life and means of survival. As the Pahadiyas were again settled agriculture, you have another group, that is the Santhals. They also started out, originally were shifting farmers, but they changed their practices quickly. So the Santhals had began to come into Bengal around the 1780s. Zamindars hired them to reclaim land and expand cultivation, and the British officials invited them to settle in the Jungle Mahals. The Santhals were given land and persuaded to settle in the foothills of the Raj Mahal, exactly the area where the Pahadiyas had established control. By 1832, a large area of the land was demarcated as Damini Koh and was declared to be the land of the Santhals. They were to live within it and practice plough agriculture and become settled farmers. The land grant to the Santhals stipulated that at least 1/10 of the area would be cleared and cultivated within the first 10 years. So there were conditions attached to this whole Damini Koh issue. The territory was surveyed and mapped. It was enclosed with boundary pillars. It and it is separated from both the worlds of settled agriculturists of the plains and the paharias of the hills. After the demarcation of the Damini coast, Santhal settlements expanded very, very rapidly. Let's look at some numbers. So, from 40 Santhal villages in the area in 1838, it grew to 1473 villages by 1851. And the population increases from just 3,000 to 82,000. We have come across a lot of Santhal myths which and songs of the 19th century, which refer very frequently to a long history of travel, and they represent the Santhal past as one of continuous mobility, and in their stories, a tireless search for a place to settle. And here in the Daminiko, their journey seems to have come to an end if we go by their stories. So, why would the Santhals have a rebellion? Because they soon found out that the land that they had brought under cultivation was slipping away from their hands. The state was levying very, very high taxes. The moneylenders were charging them very high rates of interest when they took loans, and they took over their lands when the debts remained unpaid. And thirdly, the zamindars were also trying to assert control over the Damin area. By 1850s, the Santhals felt that the time had come to rebel against the zamindars, moneylenders, and the colonial state in order for them to create an ideal world for themselves. It was after the Santhal revolt in 1855-56 that the Santhal Pargana was created, carving out 5,500 square miles from the districts of Bhagalpur and Birbhum. The colonial state hoped that by creating a new territory for the Santhals and imposing some special laws, that the Santhals could be conciliated. So when we look at a difference between the plough and the hoe, that is, plough represented the Paharias and the hoe represented the Paharias and the plough represented the Santhals. So Paharias were hunter-gatherers, whereas the Santhals had taken to farming pretty early on. Paharias practiced shifting agriculture, whereas Santhals practiced settled agriculture. The choice of their agricultural implement of the Paharias was the hoe, whereas the Santhals chose the plough. In fact, the Paharias refused to touch the plough. It was seen to be as unclean. The Paharias then receded into dry, rocky hills due to the harsh company policies, whereas the Santhals took advantage of the British policies and settled in the Daminiko and helped extend farmlands. The Santhals also played a key role in pushing out the Paharias out of the Rajmahal hills. The Paharias lost to the plough and the Santhals won against the hoe. Now let's look at the accounts of Buchanan. So when we look at his memoirs and his diaries, we get to know a fair amount of what was happening in the areas that he visited. So who was Buchanan? He was an employee of the East India Company. His journeys were not inspired by the love of landscape or the desire to discover the unknown. He was here to do a job. He marched everywhere with a large army of people, including draftsmen, surveyors, palanquin bearers, coolies, and all expenses were borne by the East India Company since they would need the information that Buchanan would collect during his travels. Buchanan was supposed to explore and record specific things, and when he arrived at a village with his army of people, he obviously was perceived as an agent of the Sarkar. So British East India Company was looking for natural resources that it could control and exploit. It surveyed landscapes and revenue sources, organized voyages of discovery, and sent its geologists and geographers, its botanists and medical men to collect information. Buchanan was one of them. Everywhere he went, he observed the stones, rocks, and the different strata and layers of the soil. He searched for minerals and stones that were commercially available and valuable. He recorded all signs of iron ore and mica, granite, and saltpeter. He recorded local practices of salt making and iron ore mining. When Buchanan wrote about a landscape, he described not the beauty of it, but how it could be transformed and made more productive economically. That is, what crops could be grown, which trees could be cut down, and which ones could be planted in their place. And we must remember that his vision and his priorities were different from those of the local inhabitants. His assessment of what was necessary was shaped by the commercial concerns of the company and modern Western notions of what constituted progress. He was inevitably critical of the lifestyles of the forest dwellers and felt that the forests had to be turned into agricultural land.